As I've said at the beginning of most of these cognitive function videos, essentially, don't worry too much about the functions, listen to lots of other people about them, and my descriptions are my individual way of understanding them. Certainly not exhaustive and very rambling. I'm likely to revisit the functions on many occasions, as I develop different ways to understand them and explain them. It's important to find your own ways of understanding them based on what works best for you and your type. Adapting versus imposing. This is a slightly complicated distinction. SE is often described as being forceful. It's about exerting force on the outside world and the surrounding environment. This is certainly an aspect of it. However, I see it as being more adaptable to the outside world. It takes in external stimuli and adjusts accordingly in real time. In the most caricatured examples, that could be in a physically intensive situation, but it could simply be in conversation too, or reading the vibe of a person or audience. It's about perceiving and observing, then adapting and adjusting. SE and NE are very similar in this regard. However, their introverted counterparts, NI and SI, are much more about controlling and imposing their will upon the external environment. Whereas SE might indeed be impactful on its environment, it's not imposing and controlling like SI. SE isn't trying to manage or micromanage things and keep them in a certain sense of order or maintained in a particular way. In that sense, SI, just like NI, is trying to take some kind of internal desire or preference and manifest it in the outside world. SE, and also NE, are much more ambivalent in this respect. They want to experience things, observe them, adapt to them, and enjoy them without necessarily wanting to get specific outcomes always. High or valued SE users might resonate with the notion of feeling connected to their environment, almost as if they can feel it and move with it, kind of like tapping into the force. SI is more about observing things first and then taking some kind of action based on that. There's more conscious intent behind it. My favorite words to describe SI are maintenance and homeostasis. Again, it's about keeping things regulated in a certain way. SI is like a thermostat, something that's excellent at monitoring the levels of things. It's my view that SI is much more likely than SE to spot changes and deviations from the norm. For example, if an object was moved in a room that is often visited by the person, if they have high SI, they might be more likely to spot the change. A high SE user is not going to be as attuned to those things. If someone is thrown into a situation that they are not very familiar with, then the high SE user will now be the most observant one. Dealing with all of the new sensory information is going to be easy for them. They're not going to feel out of their depth or struggling to keep up. SE is like an excellent conqueror. SI is an excellent ruler. Details. Is SI more detail-oriented than SE? I would say yes, it is. The most obvious or common way this shows up is in their descriptions of things. When a high or valued SI user is describing something, they would typically use a lot of detail, sometimes an unnecessary amount of detail. Although, whether you see it that way, does depend on your own type as well. SI is linked to NE, its opposite function. So if someone is a high SI type, i.e. having SI higher than NE in their function stack, they'll want to understand things in a detail-oriented way and a concrete way. Then gradually over time, will seek out more and more perspectives. Unlike a dominant NE type, who would understand a topic more by jumping from one angle or perspective to another very quickly. Let's take a brief detour and talk about the function axis of SI and NE. Let's say that an SI DOM and an NE DOM were tasked with mapping out an area. The archetypical NE DOM approach would be to travel from town to town in that area, filling in some of the details, trying to quickly capture the essence of the place, the salient and interesting details that distinguish it and make it identifiable, but quickly moving on to the next area without staying too long. If you imagine them shooting around the area really quickly, almost like a car going around a racetrack, and with every cycle or lap, they gradually add more and more detail. An SI DOM, on the other hand, would go to one area and capture a great deal of detail, such as choosing a particular town and really digging into it, building up this in-depth picture of it, capturing the subtleties and minutiae. NE, SI, is jumping around a lot and slowly building up a detailed picture. SI NE is acquiring a lot of in-depth detail from the outset. Both are eventually going to end up with the same thing, they just have different ways of going about it. An SE DOM, on the other hand, it takes in detail details often through experience, and kind of drinks them in by osmosis. They're not necessarily going about it in a conscious or intentional way. They're not trying to catalogue things and classify things. They're just experiencing them. Over time, these experiences and observations solidify as ideas about the world. As a result of their NI, their default mode is to take in information that is immediately useful. Then, as time goes on, they pick up on trends and patterns that they see recurring in the data. Their NI is going on kind of in the background. I've often thought of it as being like a detective, taking in all of the clues, speaking to people, going from crime scene to crime scene, then having that NI working slowly and gradually in the background. Then once they've taken in enough data and experiences, often in quite a scattershot way, that NI will bubble up with some kind of insight, often one that is very reliable because it is built from and grounded in more concrete data and experiences. The past. The stereotype of SI, giving a lot of weight to the past, I think is accurate. SI learns from mistakes very well, maybe more than any other function in fact. This is a double-edged sword though. On the one hand, if something fails, they'll really let that experience sink in. They'll internalize it and learn all of the lessons from it. Similarly, if they have great success, they might want to continue on with that same approach again and again. So the issue here is that it makes them reluctant to shake things up. Sometimes a thing fails just because things fail. A negative SI association towards it might unfairly dissuade a person from attempting that thing again. On the flip side, they might also repeat some of the same tried and tested formulas too much. So radical and bold change is something that takes high SI users a while to execute on. In fact, that is a very good barometer of maturity if you are an SI Dom. To what extent do you willingly embrace change, even when it's not essential? Integrating that any desire to experiment and test things is a really healthy and extremely powerful thing for them to do, precisely because they will actually take the time to really learn and understand the results of those experiments and tests. SE, on the other hand, is much more freewheeling and doesn't spend that much time reflecting or dwelling just in general, including when it comes to the past and actually the future as well. For example, if things worked out well in the end in a given situation, SE isn't necessarily going to sift back through their experience and try to analyze all of the little details about it. Rather, the sentiment will be more like, well, did I die? If not, then it's probably fine. Am I saying that SE DOMs aren't going to learn their lesson quickly? Well, compared to SI DOMs, yes. And to a certain extent in general too, yes. You might think that's a pretty big drawback to have, but it's very much offset and compensated for by their adaptability and ability to navigate shifting terrain and difficult situations exceptionally well. Because they can get themselves out of potentially sticky situations, they don't feel much need to avoid getting into them in the first place, because after all, they didn't die. Over time, they do naturally pick up on those recurring themes and patterns in their life. Again, a great barometer for maturity in SE DOMs is the extent to which they will go back through their lives and analyze those repeated patterns of behavior and figure out whether they're good or bad. Which ones do they keep and perfect, and which ones do they discard, rather than purely acting on impulse in the moment, even when they themselves kind of know better. Variety versus familiarity. I think an underlying theme throughout many of the differences between SE and SI is routine and consistency, SI, versus variety and new experiences, SE. Some simple questions you can ask yourself is how often you can repeat the same things without getting bored. To what extent do you feel the need to have variety, kind of for its own sake? If you have to repeat the same task over and over, will you do it the same way each time, or will you do it differently each time? I would even say that it's more common for high or valued SE users to get bored in general, in fact, and require that need for stimulation from the new. You could say that SI wants quality experiences and SE wants quantity of experiences. Obviously, everyone wants to have good experiences, but SE, with its desire for variety, I think will resonate with the phrase, a change is as good as a break. Sometimes doing something new is rejuvenating for them and re-energizes them. Just the fact that it's something different is the appeal for them. Another distinction that I'll add here at the end is that SI prefers time and space to plan and perfect, whereas SE desires immediacy, instant action, instant impact, and feedback. Feel free to let me know down below in the comments your own observations about SE and SI and how they compare and contrast. Also, please subscribe to the channel, and if you want to guarantee being notified whenever a new video is released, also consider clicking the notification bell.